But before I go into the next panel, I want to take a bit of a poll of the audience, because I think transport and mobility is something that's so universal. It affects us all. As I said, it is the way we all got here. So with no judgment, I want to understand, how did we all actually get here today? So who took an e-bike to get here? All right, okay. Who took an Uber? Probably some people did, but maybe we're feeling a little judged. Who took public transport? Train, whoa. All right then, okay, this is good, great. We're talking to the right people. So Diana, I really like the way you gave us some criteria of how we can assess sustainable, affordable transport. These 4 criteria: emissions-free, healthy, safe, smart. I think that's a really great lens to try and understand what does sustainable, low-carbon, inclusive transport systems look like. And so to really kind of dig deep into this topic, you also mentioned a few trade-offs. It's not so simple. There's legacy infrastructure. There are mindsets that need to be changed. There are cultural headways as well. So to help us unpack that, I am happy to welcome on stage our panel, Mr. Christophe Gros, Director of Energy Transition from Enedis. Quite the fan base you've got here today. Mr. Thomas Osdoba, Director of NetZeroCities, and Toussaint Wattinne, co-founder and CEO of Upway. Let's go. Hey. All right, so your mics are over there, so make sure everyone's got a mic so people can hear us. Good. Great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in this conversation. I want to, set the first question for you, Christophe, because you work on smart charging projects, and I want to understand from you, beyond the technical grid capacity, is there a regulatory or behavioral hurdle that currently prevents, let's say, a neighborhood from sharing energy between electric vehicles and local buildings today?
Okay, thank you very much, Hilda. Yeah, we are currently working on smart charging because smart charging, regarding all the mobility segments and regarding all use cases for charging, smart charging is really necessary, and it brings benefits to everyone. It will bring benefits to the electric system, but it will bring benefits to the customer himself. For instance, if you can charge during the solar hours in the summer, you will take advantage on very cheap electricity prices. Then we've got to smart charge, and we work on it, we develop it, we allow it at Enedis. And then another topic is sharing electricity, and this is also possible. There's no real barrier. It's fast developing in France. We've got a frame called collective self-consumption. People join locally, and they are generating their own electricity and sharing it at a local scale. And we've got thousands of, between 1,000 and 2,000 operations still running in France, yet running. And for instance, I could tell about operations led by social landlords. We've got one in, for instance, in the Lorraine region with 125 families benefiting from low-price electricity generated locally. Then there is no real barrier. It's developing. It's fast growing.
So there's no real barrier. What are we doing here? Thank you so much, Christophe. Maybe to pivot a little to you, Thomas, because you work with 112 cities, as stated in your mission. What do you believe? Because I think even listening to Christophe, there are many solutions out there. There are many pilots. But one thing we just cannot reach is the scale. And what do you think is preventing us from transforming all of these pilots to get to scale?
Thanks for the question, and I'll clarify. I probably don't work with 112 cities myself. I think I'd be a skeleton if I tried to do that. But NetZeroCities is supporting 112 cities on an aggressive program to try to achieve climate neutrality in an accelerated fashion. And it's a really interesting opportunity to probe on the question you're asking about how do we get to scale faster, how do we replicate more readily. And I think, you know, I remember 30 years ago, we used to say pilots are where good ideas go to die. And I think the reality is not quite that cynical, but I think what we do find in many cases is that pilot projects are developed either because it's already pushing the envelope of what people think is possible, and so they're not necessarily trying to do more than that, or it's because it's all they have resources for. And so we end up scoping something as a pilot, and oftentimes that doesn't lead to follow-on action because it's disconnected from broader processes. And I just want to ask, how many people are familiar with the process that Stockholm went through when they adopted their congestion pricing mechanism for the center city? Anybody familiar with that? It's almost 20 years old now, or roughly 20 years old. So they conceived it as a pilot. And they took advantage of the natural geography they had, which is the center city is an island with 7 points of entry. And so easy to put in a congestion pricing pilot. But what they did is they didn't just put it in place for a 6-month period of time. They put it in place 6-month period of time with a referendum at the end. And so there was an immediate trigger to what happens next. It wasn't just, well, we'll do it, and then we'll analyze it, and then we'll see, which is a recipe for doing nothing, because it's too easy for people to refrain from the hard action that comes. And what they found was the referendum passed, and it passed by a significant margin because people saw the benefit, and they embraced it more as a pilot because they felt involved in the decision-making that would follow. So to get past that, I think one of the things, I just made 3 quick notes around how to think about process if you're the city in particular. One is to really think about the direct process steps that come out of the end of the pilot project. So replication and scaling, what would that look like? And be quite detailed about that in designing the pilot itself. The second is to make sure resources are there to support the needed action and inputs for decision making immediately following the pilot. Again, if it's to do a pilot, stop and then analyze it, it's very unlikely you're going to find the kind of momentum that you're looking for, because it's too easy for resistance, it's too easy for entropy to take over, and you end up not moving forward. And then the third would be to have an explicit engagement of political decision makers and citizen stakeholders on the implications of what a successful pilot means. So if this works, this is what happens next. And you're having that conversation in advance with stakeholders, with political decision makers, so that everybody has the same expectations.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I totally agree. And indeed, I think trying to design for scale from the outset, right? This is what I'm understanding from you. Really intentionally wanting a pilot to scale and designing it in a way that makes sure that the roadmap is prepared for that. And one of the things you mentioned is also one of those hurdles that's a bit more of a slow burn, right? There's not like a turnkey solution when it comes to changing mindsets and perception of alternatives and pilots. And for that, I want to come to you, Toussaint, because you are building e-bike solution across Europe and also in the US. And something that we've all touched upon today is, you know, tackling the perception of some of these solutions, the perception of e-bikes, which at the moment is still seen to be more niche, more catered to a specific type of user, a more kind of, you know, eco-conscious user. How do you deal with that as you're running a startup that, you know, needs to scale? So you need a kind of a big TAM. Can you tell us a bit about this perception and how you're tackling that at Upway?
Yeah, totally, and we can definitely share an interesting perspective because we operate in 9 countries, as you mentioned, in Europe and the US. And so we also see the difference in perception across Germany, Netherlands, compared to France, the US, or Spain. And so it's really interesting to see the journey that each of these countries is going through. I think the first thing that stands out is that e-bikes is probably the fastest way to turn mobility, to electrify mobility today in cities and even in rural areas. And I think that's because what you see is that the barrier to acquire an e-bike and use an e-bike is very low, and it's a very powerful way to replace 1 in 2 trips done by car today. A stat that is probably not known enough is that 1 in 2 car trips travel less than 10 kilometers. This is the kind of distance that e-bikes are perfectly suited for. It's fit for purpose because you can effortlessly ride longer distances, uphill, headwind, you name it. And so what that means is that we're seeing this huge shift happening, and each country is at a different stage of that transition. But the reality is we're seeing that, yeah, you can avoid congestion, you can avoid parking tickets, and have an easy way to move around for the half trips done by car today. But when you do that transition and when people basically move to e-bikes, it doesn't just change traffic, it changes cities. Because what you find is that you get quieter streets, less air pollution, more active citizens, and so healthier people, and a lower cost of living. Because again, the cost of ownership is so much lower than the cost of ownership of a car. And so what that means is that the first thing that we see happen and that we need for the perception to change is to raise awareness of all of these benefits. But it's not just the benefits in theory, it's also the benefit to your everyday life. People don't adopt some kind of theoretical mobility solutions from one day to the next. They adopt convenience. And the powerful thing about e-bikes is that they become incredibly convenient to a very vast population. I think there's a great illustration, in Paris here today. Within the last 10 years, Paris has become a super influential biking city. And largely because people have adopted and jumped onto this the bandwagon of the convenience of e-bikes. And there was no better illustration than that, than the mayor celebrating his election on an e-bike, which shows just the journey we've been on in a city like Paris. So clearly this perception is happening and the change is happening. And what we need more of is, first, the convenience of e-bike is making that happen by default. But on top of that, raising awareness of the multiple benefits that light electric mobility can bring to cities can help more countries jump on the e-bike bandwagon.
Thank you. You had me at avoiding parking tickets, so I'm sold. Yeah, I think that's great, and indeed it's something that requires awareness. It also requires more data points, right? We kind of have to prove to the public and society with some evidence-based approaches to show that this is a better alternative. It is convenient, low cost, all of the amazing things you said. So we're not there yet, but I think we are definitely going in the right direction. And coming to the point about an evidence-based approach, I'd like to bring it back to Christophe, because you're running the electric mobility lab, testing some solutions on smart charging, and operating very large fleets. So I want to understand from you, as you are at the very early stage of some of these testings of new solutions, how do you go about bridging, the theory and the practice at Enedis?
Okay. Yeah, we've got a luck at Enedis. It's that we've got both a theoretical way of seeing the smart charging, the devices, the use cases. We've got a lab to test all that use cases, that technologies. And we've got another source of feedback being our fleet, because we operate a fleet of nearly 8,000 electric vehicles now. We are aiming 50% share in 2026, and it's a way for us to lower our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. We've got a commitment to lower it by 30% by 2030. And we spared 5 million liters of diesel last year thanks to the electric vehicles. Then we've got experience on the field, and then we can combine both lab and field experience. And what we see is that there is no one size fits all. There are technologies that are not yet mature, that can be mature for some use cases, but not for all use cases. For instance, we are working on induction. It's not mature for every use case. For someone, it can be mature, it can be useful, but not for every use case. then our approach is really a test and learn. There's much to learn, much to innovate. We must test it in the lab, test it in the field, and innovation is key. And there is a long way, but we were on it.
Amazing, and I like to see how some of the dots are connecting, right? As Thomas mentioned about, building pilots to scale. Are you also having that approach in your lab, with the tests that you make? Are you considering the scaling component?
The scaling to have a bigger, we are focused on, succeeding, let possible the development of electric mobility. It has been said, electric mobility is key to decarbonize transportation, to decarbonize the economy. We know that the transport is a huge source of carbon emission. Just let me highlight first that in France we've got two major assets. We've got low carbon electricity, and 95% of electricity generated in France through nuclear, renewable, is carbon free. And we've got another major asset, we've got a robust electric network that allows to connect generation to consumption, and it goes both ways. We've got more and more people that self-generate part of their needs. And we've got everything in place to be at the scale of mobility for every segment from bikes to cars to public transportation to light to heavy trucks. It gives benefits, including for the cities, because when a truck enters the city, electric truck, there's no CO2 emission, there's no other gas emission, and it's a huge benefit for local, way of or local people living there. And then everything is in place to be at the scale. We can address all the mobility segment and all the charging use cases, being at home, on the motorways, fast charging, slow charging. Then we are focused on succeeding the electric mobility for everyone and every segment.
Thank you, Christophe. With that in mind, maybe we can kind of take this to the ground level and bring it back to you. As you mentioned, you work in cities and you advocate for zero emission delivery zones. One of the hurdles I imagine in rolling out these zero emission delivery zones is the social friction between small local businesses who fear these zones and the sort of solutions that are being proposed. How do you sort of suggest that cities handle the social friction from your experience?
Thanks. Yeah, right now across the cities involved in the mission, one of the things we're exploring quite a lot is how to go from a lot of pilot projects that have been started around urban logistics and moving away from large trucks or fossil fuel powered vehicles for delivery to those that are fossil fuel free and at an appropriate scale. And I think it's definitely at the forefront of what we're doing right now. And by far the most important thing in engagement of small local businesses in a community is to not engage them as if you're seeking their consent. Because it really reduces it to a transactional relationship that's not going to go well in terms of good decision making. You really want to build an authentic, credible relationship that builds trust, and that means engaging them as real stakeholders. And if you can do that through your processes and spending time, because it is an investment of resource to build that relationship and spend time, you can start to really get past sort of the first layer of engagement and look at data together. There's pretty good data that shows in communities that local businesses where there's street parking for cars versus where there's not street parking for cars, but maybe for bicycles and more pedestrian amenities, they actually do better. They do more business, more customers, and the customers stay longer and spend more money. So there's decent data to support that. I think the other thing is to engage in a conversation around placemaking. Since I've come over to Europe about 8 years ago, one of the things I notice is a lot of times there are really great small local businesses, but they're maybe in the wrong space. It's maybe too big, it's maybe around the corner as opposed to on the street, and I think cities really need to build up their placemaking capacity and do more around designing better experiences, both for pedestrians and customers, and for the businesses themselves, who often are trying to make it work in places that aren't ideally set up, but that's what's available, that's what they think's available to them. So I think that's a critical piece to part of the strategy. It's also true that the benefits of less congestion, better air quality, a more inviting neighborhood are really attractive to customers who local businesses care about. You know, the last thing I want to say, just very briefly on a broader note, it's very important for cities right now to be engaged with small local businesses. The current economic order is really stacked against them. And I think we really need to recognize that cities and small businesses need to work together in order for those businesses to survive. To avoid doing something because it may feel difficult is a recipe for what's going on now, which is a continued trajectory away from supporting small local businesses.
Yes, I totally agree. I think I also sense that there is a lack of trust between, you know, the cities and the locals of, you know, respective cities. And I think that, you know, leads us to a great segue to you, Toussaint, because you are one of these startups who are working in cities and also with local communities. And I want to build a bit on what you said before, you know, building this trust among local community, but also having to work on with the cities to, you know, have the scale and the access at the end of the day. When we look at, you know, the perception, and you at Upway, you're really focused on, you know, the resource efficiency of mobility. How do you, you know, bring this message home for policymakers and the public, and kind of, you know, bring this idea of refurbishment being more inclusive and sustainable? What is your strategy? What is your approach? And what are some, you know, successes or failures that you've experienced?
Yeah, I think for a bit of context, since everyone probably doesn't know about Upway, we buy and refurbish used e-bikes, and then we resell them online under warranty. And as I mentioned earlier, we do that in 9 countries in Europe and the US. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we, the mission and the reason we started Upway was to make light electric mobility accessible to everyone. So this idea of inclusivity is at the heart of what we do, and sustainability as well, and I'll come back to that. But our first conviction is that the only way we will succeed at transitioning towards clean mobility is if it can work for everyone. And the reality today is that it's not always affordable to do so. So affordability is absolutely key. And to us, and to me, e-bikes are a first major unlocker of that, because the total cost of ownership of e-bikes is a lot lower than car ownership. And the second aspect that we are investing a lot of our energy into is to use the second-hand refurbished market as a way to lower that barrier of entry even further. So on average, we've sold 100,000 e-bikes in the last 4 years since we got started, and our average selling price is half of the retail price of the bikes we sell. So clearly, we can continuously fight to make light electric mobility more and more affordable and more inclusive by design. And it's very clear that any national policy that overlooks bikes, e-bikes, refurbished e-bikes as part of its strategy is missing out on a very cost-effective way of getting everyone on board with a cleaner mobility solution. Secondly, it's sustainable not just because it's low emission or no emission. It's what we're striving to achieve is to make sure that every e-bike that makes it to the market has the longest lifetime possible. And so by design, what we're doing is ensuring that every product that is there is used for longer and is used better by making sure that we can refurbish it, repair it, replace the parts. And that's another key component in my view of making sure we can reduce, of course, the waste footprint of the category, but also the CO2 emissions, because 2/3 of the emissions per kilometer of an e-bike today come from the manufacturing stage. And so the more we can extend its lifetime, the more mileage that bike can do, the more we're offsetting this initial carbon footprint over a longer time and a longer lifetime. So that's really what we're focusing on. And I think the message is the more policymakers can fully realize that, one, it's at a time of tight public finances, one of the most cost-effective ways to transition towards electric mobility is to encourage bike and e-bike adoption. And second, to make sure that we're designing systems and products that have the longest lifetime possible to offset this manufacturing stage over the longest time possible.
No, that's amazing, and like the cost effectiveness, I think, is really key in this piece, but also very important to engage the public sector, right? And I think another sort of elephant in the room when we talk about transport and mobility is, the infrastructure hurdles, right? I think most of us do want to adopt more sustainable, more efficient mobility and transport practices, but sometimes the infrastructure isn't working in our advantage to do so. And here I'm referring mainly also to charging deserts, for example. So when you do have an electric vehicle or an electric bike, it can be hard to keep the energy going just because of charging deserts. So I'd like to bring the next question over to you, Christophe, to give us some insights on fast charging on highways as a priority, but how is Enedis ensuring that the grid in lower income urban areas where residents lack, for example, private garages, how are we considering this within these communities?
You're right that the infrastructure is key because people, it can be a barrier, a psychological barrier first. Because, for instance, in France, we've got one of the best equipped countries in Europe. We estimate that we've got more than 2,800,000 charging points, mainly at home, but including 190,000 charging points on the public, being streets, being supermarket parking lots, etc., and including 40,000 fast charging points. Then we've got a good, well-equipped country, but we can say that we don't have any charging deserts for now, but we have to adapt, we have to upgrade the infrastructure at the good pace. The good pace is not the same pace everywhere. The good pace is the pace that allows all the charging needs to be satisfied. It can be fast charging on the motorways, it can be slow charging at home, in rural, in urban cities. And the key for it is to forecast and to plan the development of a network and of the infrastructure. And for this, we've got to have a dialogue with all the stakeholders, beginning with the local authorities. Because when you're in dense areas, you've got to have a dialogue on what is the aim, where is there a place to install charging facilities, and then the dialogue is the key, the forecasting, planning. We are planning in France up to 2035 and up to 2050 now. We are on very long cycle of planification, and this will ensure there is no charging deserts in the future years. There is no, for now in France, charging desert, but we have to do, and it's doable. We can do it. For people to have a facility to charge vehicle and not to be feared of missing electricity because it's a psychological barrier. Our employees, when they've got their first electric cars, the fear of it, is the battery enough to have all the day, the work day satisfied, but when they have the electric vehicle, they don't want to get back to thermic one. We often say at Enedis that electric mobility is not possible, it's better.
Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure hurdles are there, but indeed, once you go electric, it's hard to go back. Maybe coming back to you on this one too, Toussaint. Really sticking to the infrastructure piece. And I'd like to hear from you, based on your experience, based from data that you've gathered. What do you think is the single biggest missing piece in the city, or the infrastructure in the city, that would make your users feel safer and more supported?
Yeah, infrastructure plays a huge role, and it's great to have had an introduction by the city of Mannheim, because of course they're an example that plays a leading role in building the infrastructure that helps change mobility habits. The first piece of infrastructure that any city needs is protected cycling infrastructure. That means protected lanes that are continuous and which make riding a bike feel totally normal as opposed to feeling risky. And that's exactly what's happened in the Netherlands since the 1970s. They started, for the last 50 years, they invested in these protected bike lanes That's what makes more people feel safe, and therefore more people ride. And the more people ride, the more people feel safe, because suddenly it's a totally normal sight to have plenty of bikes around. And so car drivers typically start getting used to it, and everyone understands how to best travel together. So the first piece of infrastructure is definitely protected bike lanes, not just a piece of paint on the streets, but actually dedicated and separated bicycle infrastructure. The second thing of infrastructure is a bit more at a national level, especially, is more of a financial infrastructure to really make e-bikes accessible to everyone. And again, that's where Germany is a great example. We know that the single most effective policy is to introduce bike leasing schemes with tax benefits for employees. And that's a scheme that has been incredibly popular in Germany. Employees benefit from a tax saving. Employers improve their employees' experience at no extra cost to them. And countries accelerate adoption of bikes and e-bikes across the board. And just to finish on a simple number, Germany in 2016 was selling 500,000 new e-bikes and 3.2 million new cars, so 6 times more new cars than e-bikes. By 2022, so only 7 years later, they were selling 2.2 million new e-bikes and 2.6 million new cars. So only 20% more cars than e-bikes. Can you see the gigantic wave of change in people choosing which equipment they're gonna buy to move around? And a major driver of that has been the combination of safe bike lanes and a financial infrastructure through bike leasing that has made it easy for anyone to adopt an e-bike.
Thank you for that. And you know, earlier in the speakers lounge, you also mentioned that Berlin is one of your biggest markets. So I guess that is a testament to some of these infrastructure policies that they have in place. So I am very conscious of time. So to round up our panel, I'd like to bring the last question to you, Thomas. You know, from your very high level perspective, working across many cities, if you could say, you know, if there was a specific gold standard city policy that really, you know, helped the private sector to change their business model rather than just greenwashing it, you know, because we're seeing a lot of greenwashing around some of these solutions that sound really great, but when it comes to implementation, maybe is not really bearing the benefits we're looking for. From your experience, what is maybe the one policy or few policies that you've seen actually stick and actually work?
Thanks, really good question, and I'll be pretty short because I know we are pressed for time. I think so far that gold standard doesn't quite exist. And I think one of the things we have is a workshop tomorrow with a lot of SMEs, some corporates and businesses and cities to explore what a tipping point looks like and where that will go. And I think from that, what I would like to get to is something that's akin to a gold standard on the procurement side. And for those who maybe haven't heard, there's a term in procurement called procuring the outcome. So instead of procuring a specific service or product, you're procuring the outcome and you're allowing the private sector flexibility and you're creating creativity in how that's being met. So collaboration from SMEs and large companies can happen, et cetera. That's really important because to get to zero carbon logistics and delivery, you need infrastructure to be aligned with policy and regulation, with data and coordination, and with the right business models. And it's impossible to procure all of those things if you're trying to prescribe the procurement. So if you procure the outcome, you'll allow that creativity to happen. And you're already seeing SMEs locally working with large companies, working with the Post and others to be able to make that system work. And so I think that's where we're headed, but we're not quite there yet. I think the goal will be in a couple of years to really see that take shape.
Amazing. So we need the creativity and agility to bring all of these cross-sectoral stakeholders together, because it is a very multi-pronged, challenging a trend, and it cannot be solved, as you mentioned, just by one member of the value chain. Everyone across the value chain needs to be aligned to make a difference. So thank you all again to the panelists for your inputs. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you so much. So I hope you're all still with me. The session is not over. We still have a fireside chat coming up. I know it's a tricky time because it's during your lunch, but we promise we will feed you food for thought, okay? It will be well worth your time.